Hello, welcome to Gardener's World. At this time of year, there's only one job that really counts, one job that you should do above all others, and that's deadheading. And that's because as the days get shorter and colder at the same time, plants are eager to put all their resources into producing seed. And once they do that, flowering dwindles to a halt. So by removing the seed heads, you're encouraging it to produce yet more flowers, to have another bash at getting some seed. Now, the plants that respond to light are really going fast, and it's asking a lot of them as the days get shorter to keep on flowering. But those that come from nearer the equator, like the cannas and dahlias and tifonias, will go on flowering, however short the days, as long as it doesn't get too cold. Take a canna like this one here, for example. You've got a lovely flower there, and that flower spike, but this flower spike has ended. So the thing to do is to cut it off right at the base there. That leaves the flowers and stops this becoming the focus of the plant's energy. And if you do this, you can keep the garden flowering and looking really good for weeks to come. On today's programme, Carol visits a garden which celebrates the onset of autumn in all its colourful glory.
This whole place is full of this glowing golden colour. The whole place is aglow.
Frances is in Glasgow to meet a gardener whose hands-off approach has helped to create a haven for wildlife.
Welcome, Frances, to my little wilderness patch.
Wow. There's certainly a lot going on here, isn't there?
And I shall be sowing a mix of wildflowers in my orchard to provide a banquet of pollen and nectar for my bees. Do you remember that I sowed this bed with seeds in the middle of July? And the idea being that you could still sow seeds in the middle of summer and get a harvest. Well, not only have we got a harvest, we've been eating a lot of it. These are little gem lettuce, and they have been really good. The oak leaf lettuce has grown very well indeed. Spinach has been and gone, and I've replaced it with the rocket. We've got climbing beans here, and a lovely crop of purple podded beans. Now, the long and the short of it is, sow some seed. As long as you get something in the ground by the beginning of August, you've got yourself a vegetable garden. It's garlic planting time. I like to get this done in September if I can, although October, November, and even December is fine. But this is something you absolutely want to do by Christmas. Garlic needs a period of vernalization, of cold weather. Otherwise it will grow, but it won't form separate cloves. I'm planting elephant garlic today. And I've got here this year's harvest, and you can see that the individual bulbs are whoppers, but they are actually more delicately flavored than some of the smaller garlics. Now, there are two things to remember when you're planting garlic, whether it's a whopping great clove like that or quite a small one. First of all, pointy end up. And the second thing is to plant it quite deep. Ideally, you want the depth of the clove, again, above it with soil. And these are fairly large plants. They will grow about 3 foot tall, and you need a good 8 to 9 inches in between them. And down we go. Whatever type of garlic you want to grow, the planting technique is the same. Now, if I just gently rake over the soil, it'll fill the holes and those will appear sometime around the middle of November. And the important thing about all types of garlic is to develop really good foliage. They need water, they need nutrients, and of course sunshine. And that in turn will feed back into the bulb. I always feel that getting garlic in the ground is a real sign that autumn is here. But Carol has been to a garden in the Cotswolds where they haven't given up on summer at all. The garden is still just radiant with colour.
As the vibrancy of summer begins to fade, our gardens can start to look a bit on the tired side. But here at East Leach House, there are all manner of plants that are just coming into their own, making early autumn a pure celebration. This is the Rill Garden, and right now it's packed with plants that all of us could use to bring colour to our borders at this time of year. It's divided up into colour sections, just like a rainbow. Here there are a whole variety of different pinks. This is Prince Heinrich. It's a beautiful autumn flowering anemone, and it's doing what these anemones always do, wandering around and putting itself up here and there, and always looking perfect. One of the things I really like about this variety is that these flowers have 5 sepals, but having that odd number makes the flowers almost oblong, quite different from other anemones. It's used here next to a hydrangea. When this was planted, it was blue wave. It still is blue wave, but because of the high alkalinity of the soil, the hydrangeas turn to the prettiest pale pink. And then in the background are 2 big tall plants vying for the space. One is a eupatorium, a great big Joe Pye weed with these big fluffy heads of flowers. Next door to it, Clerodendron bungii. Don't you just love that name? This has these big heads of small pink flowers. It's got very dark stems and dark foliage, so it's a really dramatic plant. Taken all together, not only do the colours blend so beautifully well, but also it has this glorious informality as things wander backwards and forwards. This bed absolutely sizzles with orange flowers, all put together so beautifully, and lots of differences in texture and shape and form too. The centrepiece is this dahlia. It's David Howard. It's one of the most reliable of all dahlias. And in the background is this helenium. It just brings that orange colour, this lovely fiery mass right through the bed. I think this is a really clever combination too. This is Macleia cordata, the plume poppy. And in this case, the plumes are orange. The leaves are glaucous, so that lovely sort of bluey green makes the orange even brighter. And then in the foreground, just to soften the whole picture, is this grass. It's Anamanthale lawsoniana, used to call it Stipa arundinacea. And it tumbles wherever you put it. It's soft, billowy, and it really completes this beautiful picture. There are a collection of blue plants here which are at their very best at this time of year. Asters, which are absolutely full of flower. And wending its way through the centre of the arrangement is this lovely geranium roseanne. And then a really exciting clematis. This one is Clematis cassandra, and it's got these deep, rich blue flowers. It's a herbaceous clematis, so it will die down right to the ground each year. You can cut it hard back and up it will come the following spring. But it saves most of its flowering until the late summer and the autumn. And added to all its virtues, this clematis also has delicious scent. In front of it is a plant that's really for the early autumn. It's Ceratostigma wilmotianum. It has possibly the richest of blue flowers, true ultramarine. And very shortly, they'll be joined by the foliage going brilliant reds and oranges and russets. It really is the perfect autumnal picture. Although this is a garden on a grand scale, there are so many good examples here of how to make the most of a small space. Take this little bed in front of the windows. It's packed with a few simple, straightforward plants, starting off with this teucrium, silvery and bringing light to the whole affair. And then on the wall behind it, this dark fuchsia, just a straightforward Fuchsia magellanica, the hedging fuchsia. But the fuchsia forms the perfect foil for these big pale pink lily flowers of the crinum, great strap-like leaves, and absolutely glorious in this autumn sunshine. And then, spilling out onto the gravel, is another teucrium. This one is Comedris, hugely attractive to bees, and the perfect foil for this great big dahlia. This is Purple Gem. And it really is the thing which brings this whole association to life. Another way of cramming more into a small space is to use one plant as a host for another. Here, an unusual Chinese clematis, Clematis fargesii, clambers through a shrubby potentilla. Look at this Helianthus lemon queen. It's just coming into bloom now and it's going to go on looking good for months on end. In fact, this whole place is full of this glowing golden colour. The whole place is aglow. When we talk about autumn colour, it's often with an air of sadness, leaves changing colour gradually. But if you choose the right plants and put them together with partners that enhance them, you can keep that colour going right the way through for months on end.
I'm transforming the orchard. For the first 15 years or so when we were here, this was lovely long grass that flowed like silk when it was full grown, but gradually the weeds have taken over. So I am now transforming this into what will be a wildflower meadow in an orchard. Back in July, we highlighted the loss of 97% of our wildflower meadows in the UK, which is devastating for our pollinating insects. The good news, though, is that we gardeners can help and make a real difference. Last month, I sowed a small verge with wildflower seed, but now I want to do it on a much larger scale, although the method remains exactly the same. Now, if you're making a wildflower meadow, you do have to reduce the grass as much as possible. A really good meadow is 80% flowering plants and 20% grass. So if you've got a lawn or an area of long grass, you need to beat the hell out of it. Rip it to shreds. Try and expose as much soil as you can. So I've cut it as low as possible. But even that isn't enough, because the next stage is to rip it up even more, make matters worse. And for that, I've hired a scarifier. And a scarifier is really just a set of blades. If you look under here, you can see that there are a whole series of blades that are driven round and they cut slots into the grass. The main purpose of a scarifier is to refresh grass at the end of the growing season, and it rips up dead thatch and moss and lets light and air in. But in this case, I'm using it to rip up some of the grass roots and also expose bare soil. Now, you can get the same effect by using a wire rake, but for a large space like this, a scarifier makes life a lot easier. If I left things as they were, it wouldn't be enough. I need to go a stage further. And for that, I have an invaluable seed to help me. It is this. It's called yellow rattle, or the meadow maker. And it's semi-parasitic on grass. So wherever it grows well, grass grows a lot less well. Now, when you buy your seed mix, there should be yellow rattle in it. But the reason why I've got extra is because in Herefordshire here, the soil is rich and the grass grows incredibly well. So I need extra oomph to try and diminish it. The seed mix that I've chosen is specifically high in pollen and nectar for our bees. What I'm trying to do is create the most fantastic banquet for them. This wants to be the best restaurant in town. And the beauty of the internet is that nowadays you can go online, look up seed mixes and choose one that is very specific for you. You can have mixes for acidic soil, for dry soil, damp soil, chalk, whatever it is. I'm going to mix the two up. This wildflower mix contains plants like the common knapweed, ox-eyed daisy, bird's foot trefoil, wild red clover, and of course, yellow rattle. Okay, here goes. Yellow rattle is a seed that must be sown fresh, and it also needs vernalization. So buy it now, sow it before the end of October. It won't germinate till next spring, but the cold and the wet will help it germinate. If you wait till next spring to sow it, it may well not work. There's no doubt about it that October is a good time to sow meadows. Now, I'm sowing it fairly thinly, about 1.5 grams per square meter. And the beauty of when you order these seeds is you work out the area and they will send you the right amount. This will be mown a couple or even 3 times before winter to keep the grass short. And also by using a mower with a roller, it will press the seed into really good contact with the bare soil, and that will help germination. There'll be nothing to see at all until next spring. But if you want a wildflower meadow filled with poppies and cornflowers, that is an arable mix and is good for a bare border that has been cultivated, and you can sow that next spring. This is a much slower business. It will gradually change and transform over a number of years, and it could take between 6 to 10 years before it really gets good. But that's slow gardening, and I like it. Now, it's interesting the way that wildflower meadows cross the boundaries between gardening, wildlife, and even farming. And Francis went to visit a garden in Glasgow, which blurs quite a few boundaries indeed.
Sometimes as gardeners, it's hard not to see insects and birds as the enemy, especially when they're busy helping themselves to all of our produce. But some people don't try and scare away wildlife. I've come to meet Ewan Sutherland, who acts actively encourages wildlife into his garden to share all of his bounty.
Welcome, Francis, to my little wilderness patch.
Wow. There's certainly a lot going on here, isn't there? And you've got trees and seed heads and grasses. So what was here when you moved in?
It was quite a traditional garden, big patch of grass, some herbaceous beds and a couple of vegetable areas as well.
So how have you come to this design?
I'm interested in wildlife gardening, in looking after nature, giving a place to nature, as it's often called. Also, I'm interested in growing food for myself, and also a type of gardening that's quite hands-off as well, so not getting too fussed about slugs eating some of my plants. Certainly not using any kind of poisons or chemicals at all, keeping everything very natural. Just having a slightly laid-back approach to it. We'll just let things do their own thing. Gardens can be overgrown and they're still a garden. So here there's a green-roofed shed which I built a few years ago, and a kind of bug hotel of sorts.
Bug hotel of sorts. I love the
yeah.
modesty. That is the most beautiful bug hotel I've ever seen. You've got something
Well,
for everything in there, haven't
Thank
you?
you. Yeah, there's ladybirds occasionally nest in here. Some bees overwinter, the wasps overwinter in the plastic down below.
And clearly spiders
And
as well.
lots of spiders too. Yeah, lots of different insects. Built using recycled materials, old hoses, old plastic bottles, plastic rubble bags, old bits of slate.
And is that a wasp feeding station?
It is today. It's actually a bird feeder I built a few years ago, and I can see now at the moment there's about half a dozen wasps feeding away on some old biscuits I put out, some of the icing in the biscuits, which is great because wasps are really important creatures for a garden. They're beautiful looking things, but they're also very much the unsung pollination heroes.
Completely underrated, aren't they?
Yes, totally.
Amazing. What's through here?
More interesting things. Come this way.
I love this slate wall. That's beautiful.
Thanks. Kind of as a demarcation line between the proper wild of a railway embankment and the
Slightly less wild.
Slightly less wild of my garden, yes.
But a great habitat as well for invertebrates.
Yeah, lots of woodlice, or slaters as we like to call them up here in Glasgow, and there's lots of other insects, etc. use as habitat as well.
And some lovely moss
and
growing.
some lovely moss growing too.
Beautiful. Okay, so we've gone on a journey through and now we're kind of back where we started.
Yeah, kind of full circle.
This might look like chaos, but actually there's a lot of traditional design methods here, aren't there? You've got wooden fencing, wooden boundaries, and you have a lawn, which you'd think of as a typical garden feature, but yours isn't quite so typical, is it?
Yeah, we've got lots of different lengths of grass, from bits that are mown every couple of weeks to bits that are left and cut only seasonally to parts that have never been cut for years. The grass is filled with all sorts of different plants now as well. Some of them are perhaps seen as weeds by other people. Things like dandelions and daisies, plantain, there's some dawkins coming up, there's ragwort, a bit of clover, and there's lots of micro-habitats for small creatures, which for me is the exciting part. Lots of things that are living in the grass as well. There's wasps and bees and hoverflies, there's froglets, there's all sorts of creatures in here.
While Ewan lets a lot of weeds do their thing, at certain times of the year, he does exert some control. With weeds like dock, he cuts them down and hangs up the seed heads for the birds. And for the more persistent weeds, he has an interesting technique. He submerges them in water. They're soaked for up to 6 months, and once completely dead, they're put onto the compost heap to rot. And as a bonus, the stagnant water in the bin creates a habitat for hoverfly larvae. Ewan doesn't just look after the wildlife in his garden. He also grows some unusual veg for himself.
This is a great pignut, or also known as an earth chestnut, also known as horticulturally...
Bunningum bulbocastanum.
Correct, well done.
So this is a native member of the carrot family, which has edible nuts or bulbs.
Edible tubers. So this is going to be food for me, and it used to be a staple food centuries ago, so I'm going to give it a shot again. But the reason for planting it was for wildlife, because these are part of the wider carrot family, and they have big umbellier flowers, which the hoverflies and bees and other pollinators love. And so it's a 2-for-1 yet again. Wildlife benefits, and then later in the season, I benefit.
Fantastic. So Ewan, why is it so important to you to have wildlife in your garden?
Well, there's probably a number of reasons, but fundamentally I think it's important for me to share the garden with all aspects of wildlife. There's not a minute goes past I can't be in the garden and find something really interesting, attractive or beautiful to engage with, whether it's a small creepy crawly or a spider's web or a small flower that's just come into bloom. There's never a moment that there's not something that can be looked at and enjoyed.
I do know that there are some people who find a garden as loose as that quite hard to get to grips with. But I once asked somebody what defined a garden, and they gave me a very wise answer. They said, every garden must have a gardener. It doesn't matter what it looks like or what's in it. If you're doing it, then that is a garden. And I thought that was really interesting. Now, I've got a problem here, but it's not one I can do much about, and I guess it's one that a lot of you are sharing, and that is to do with my roses. Lots of roses here in the cottage garden. They look fantastic in June and July, but this rather damp, mild summer that we've had here at Longmeadow has meant inevitably that we've got fungal problems. This, which is a damask rose, and the lovely Madamadi, has got bad black spot. And that's caused by the air being too damp, and that encourages the fungus. Right next to it, we've got a plant, this is a Gallica officinalis, smothered in powdery mildew, which tends to be when the plant is too dry, particularly at the roots. And that's mainly down to the way that different roses, different varieties and species react in different ways. This might be a little bit too dry because it's too close to the hedge, but my guess is that this is just one of those roses in this garden that gets powdery mildew. It's not what you're doing wrong, it's the way that certain plants react to certain climatic conditions. And the good news is that it won't harm them. They'll come back next year, flower as well as ever, and if we have a hot, dry summer, certainly there'll be a lot less black spot. Now, still to come. Adam visits a garden in West Wales, which has made the most of quite tricky conditions.
So I got bog and I got rock. And one of my great beliefs is that every problem comes with a gift in its hands, and it's my responsibility to find the gift.
But first, Mark revisits Nyman's garden, which was a boyhood favourite of his, to see how they are adapting and coping with the demands imposed upon them by climate change.
Since it was bought back in the 1890s by the Messel family, Nyman's has been famous for collections of fabulous magnolias and rhododendrons. Big, colourful beds, and spearheading the latest gardening techniques.
My parents used to bring me here because it was just on our doorstep, and it really excited that whole idea of gardening. But we used to come back year after year just to see how the garden progressed.
Nyman's has always been a centre of innovation and experimentation.
But they're also committed to making the entire garden more sustainable. So they're doing lots of experiments, including looking at water and how to use less of it.
Joe Whelan is head gardener and has seen at first hand how the historic garden has been affected by the hotter, drier conditions we've been experiencing increasingly in the last few years.
Particularly our rhododendron collection, they've really suffered. Rhododendrons are sort of notoriously shallow-rooted anyway, so they do have a habit of drying out quite quickly. And yeah, it is a big problem. We try and mulch a lot, we try and water them as little as absolutely possible, but sometimes that can be very difficult.
As a result, the team have put in a lot of work and infrastructure for big plants and small ones.
The area of the garden that we're in at the moment is the nursery. We have these amazing rainwater collection tanks. So we harvest rainwater in a couple of ways. Either rainwater that runs off the roof of the glasshouse into gutters that then goes to the tank.
But they also have an impressive groundwater recycling system. So any surplus watering sinks through the black membrane and into a filter.
It gets rid of any sediments and some bacteria, and we end up then with a suitable water at the end of it for watering.
Brilliant. That's really, really clever. And then sort of out in the garden, do you water them continually, or how do you look after them?
We tend to plant tough, so basically we'll generally water pretty heavy once when we plant, and after that it's only when absolutely necessary. So if they start to wilt or if they start to look like they're suffering, but otherwise we tend to just leave it to their own devices. And I think it's amazing how resilient plants can be. If you do that, they'll seek out the moisture rather than wait for it in a lot of cases.
They've also found this tough love creates tougher plants, which cope better with short, dry spells. But in the long term, they have other plans for their borders.
I think the main thing for us at the moment is to just try and adjust how we plant, essentially. So looking more towards planting that can tolerate dry conditions, not necessarily drought conditions, but just be that little bit more tolerant.
And they've started that already. Over the last 4 years, gardener Kirsten Kelly has created 3 South African meadow beds on Nyman's light loamy soil, with only a slight nod to the varied British weather.
I know that when you planted it, you've also done it in sort of waves, is that right, with sort of dunes?
Yeah, so that's partially for aesthetic reasons. It looks nice in the winter when there's not so much foliage there, and it's easier on the eye because the beds kind of roll away.
Yeah.
And then the second reason is for the planting. So the South African plants, they don't mind a little bit of cold, but they don't like the cold and wet. So the less hardy plants we plant on top of those dunes, and then the water drains away from them and they're much happier.
Perfect.
And then I know where they are and I don't put my big feet on them as well, so it's a win-win.
What I also love is you've sort of got this wild sort of drifts going on. Can you just explain some of the planting that you've used to create that?
Yeah, sure. So in front of us we've got the Panacetum cream falls, and that's
lovely.
Yeah, it's really lovely, and that's got lots of movement, and that's planted with the Gladioli papilio. Try to kind of match with how things might work in the wild, and then I'm getting a little bit less OCD about it and letting things grow together and do it more naturally, and that's kind of inspired by seeing how things have grown in the wild.
But Kirsten's plant choice really is impressive and varied.
You have things like eucomis,
Yep.
so that's the pineapple lily, and they kind of wander off through the bed, so they're quite quirky. The aloe striculata,
Yeah.
so you wouldn't maybe see that growing outside, and that's all spiky. So I think it's a fun bed because it showcases and it shouts out loud with colour, and so
Superb.
yeah.
There's been some surprising stars emerge from the experiment that would do well in most warm, sunny, well-drained spots. Like this Hesperantha coccinea major, or this Diasia personata, and the stunning Acapanthus innerpertus grasskop.
So this being your first bed, I mean, how much water have they really needed?
Really, just watering in when we first planted them. Maybe a couple of weeks later we watered them again, but that's been absolutely it.
So even last year when it was like really, really hot?
Yeah, absolutely. Nothing got watered in here. And actually they did really well. And even the Melianthus over here flowered for the first time, although it did start to flower, not quite make it, and held its flowers through the winter, and it's finished off this year with the good weather we're having now.
I think this approach and these beds are an absolute triumph.
It's really great to come back and see the progress of the garden, but also talking to Kirsten and finding out about that freedom and the experimentation that she's been able to do. For me, what they're doing with water-wise plants and the way they're planting is truly inspirational.
It's very interesting to hear that at Nyman's, they're treating plants tough. They're growing them hard, as the expression is. And we found that here, that always works. You water a plant in, then you leave it. You let it find water, and the roots will go deeper, and therefore when there's a drought, the plant will be better adapted to cope with that. Now we're coming to the end of the season, if you like. It's time to take stock of the Paradise Garden. Now remember, this started very slowly throughout last year. Now some things work really well. The acuminata tulips look fantastic. These lovely, tall, elegant petals. And the Verbena bonariensis has been wonderful. Has flowered, and the butterflies adore it. All the fruit, the lemons and the olives and the pomegranates have been great. But it hasn't all gone entirely to plan. I think I've chosen the wrong grass. This is Stipa tenuissima. It's a beautiful grass, it's soft, and the idea is it's a fountain that rises up and spills. And it did that until about the end of June. But then it started to get a flowering head. And what you get is this ponytail. And then it doesn't spread evenly and elegantly, it flops. And it's flopped over other plants. So it suppressed the Tolbagia that I've had to put into pots. It suppressed the Gaura that I put in thereafter. So what I'm going to do is take these great hanks of grass and just cut them back. Like that. It's like a terrible hairstyle. If the steepers respond well to this cutting back, that's fine. I can leave them in place and just keep cutting them back as and when I need to. A much bigger worry is, will they respond well to sitting in a cold, wet Herefordshire winter? Steepers do not like cold, wet conditions. And I may have to replace them, but bear in mind that I grew all these from seed. They cost 1 packet of seed, so in terms of money, that's all I've lost. We shall see. Now, any paradise garden is based upon quite strict rules, or a format, if you like. It's got to be symmetrical, it's got to have water in the middle, certain plants have to feature, and there has to be a certain atmosphere. But in June, we went to visit a garden that could not be more different if it tried.
My name's Rob. We're in the village of East Harptree on the north side of the Mendip Hills, the dark side in the Chew Valley. And this is a forest garden. And that sort of conjures up images of gardening in a forest, but it's not like that. It's gardening like a forest. It's all about symbiotic relationships in the sense that it has fruit and nut trees on top, and then smaller shrubs fill the canopy, and they're perennial vegetables covering the ground. It's like companion planting on a huge scale. Elaeagnus umbellata, sometimes called autumn olive. It really is the ultimate multi-purpose shrub. It has so many uses. It has little tropical tasting berries you can eat in the autumn time, hence the name autumn olive. It has little star-shaped, sweet, sweet-smelling flowers that are nectar-heavy, very good for honeybees. It's a nitrogen fixer, very important here for fertility. It grows very well from cuttings. It's a fast grower. As a structural plant, it's providing a very good windbreak here, protecting all kinds of plants around it. It's good to grow things up. I have some mashua, or air potato as it's called, growing up it. And it's quite a beauty as well, really. It's the best way to be self-sufficient. I mean, it takes a lot of setting up, but once it's set up, it's pretty much self-sustaining. It just takes a little bit of tweaking here or there, perhaps a day a month. And all I have to do each morning or each afternoon is just go around and look for what's growing and pick my own food. The chuckleberry. Brilliant name, but really it's just a cross between a gooseberry, a red currant, and a josterberry, actually. Very, very tasty, these large, black, juicy berries. They're a must in any garden. I suppose about half of what I eat comes from the garden at the moment, but then I'm only in year 5 of the 7-year plan. When I first got the land 6 years ago, I spent the first year walking around and assessing the environment, just watching the movement of the sun and where there were frost pockets and where the rain ran down across the land, where the swampy areas were, where the dry areas were, and also what plants were here already that I wanted to keep. There was lemon balm here naturally, and I didn't want to plant over that. The main thing I use it for is if I'm going out to any social occasions and I get a little bit nervous. The oils in it are really good for calming one's nerves, so I just rub it around myself, and people often compliment me on my wonderful aroma. But also I use it for smearing around empty honeybee hives to attract the scout bees. And there was actually an occasion a few years ago when I was getting ready for a wedding and rubbing myself with lemon balm, and the sky darkened with a swarm of honeybees, 10,000 strong. They were moving into a hive near where I was standing, but many of them landed on me because it smells very similar to the queen bee pheromone. But I was quite calm, and they moved into the hive in the end, and it was a happy ending, and it was a great wedding. I love this garden because I created it, but also because I'm actually part of the garden. I'm part of the ecosystem. I spread the seeds of certain plants. I help things to grow. Most plants here have a direct edible use. The plant I use most is the Tuna sinensis, or Chinese cedar. And that really is a unique taste. And it's so fantastic for enhancing the flavour of stews and soups. It's like the veggie stock cube tree. Most of the plants here have at least 3 purposes, or I wouldn't plant them. Everything's got to be multifunctional. Common mullein, Verbascum thapsus. They have quite an illustrious history of medicinal uses. I use them in their most degrading way for them, probably, as toilet paper. They're soft and strong and long. They have lovely, soft, moisturising leaves, but they've got little hairs on, and if you rub them the wrong way, they can cause a bit of a rash. That's actually where another of their names comes from, Quaker's Rouge, because Quaker women didn't used to be able to wear makeup, and they rubbed them on their cheeks to make a nice rougey effect. One of the biggest challenges in creating this place has been the lack of a budget. Apart from the cost of the land initially, I've only had £1,000 for absolutely everything. This is my wonderful low-budget greenhouse, and having hardly any budget, I've had to start from scratch and plant everything from seed or from cuttings, which is quite satisfying, really. It really means you get to see the plants from the start, and there are all kinds of treasures just here. There are some perennial sunflowers and pawpaws and persimmons and perennial broccoli and sweet Sicily. There's even some licorice and some quinine just here. By growing things from seed or from cuttings, even though they've taken a little more tending to initially, they've done a lot better than the plants that I have bought, and in fact have overtaken them. Using the Italian red alder as an example, I planted that as a seed 5 years ago, and now I can climb it. Only 5 years old, planted from a seed. Imagine if everyone did this sort of thing. I mean, not only can this 1 hectare forest garden feed 10 people all year round, it's restoring the ecosystem, it's creating habitat for all the local wildlife. It's a very resilient system too. It's flood resistant, it's drought resistant, and there's so much diversity that even if 1 thing or 2 things or 20 things got killed by disease, there'd be 100 other things to take their place. Another thing that makes this plot quite special is that it used to belong to my great-grandparents, I'm not quite sure what my great-grandfather will think of what I'm doing now. I think he'd be amazed that I'm growing lemons and peaches and grapes. I can hear him saying now, actually, how are you going to make and pay? But it's not really about money. It's about living with the very lightest footprint on the earth possible and having fun in the process. Food forests are fun.
Forest gardening is really tricky to make work, but I know a lot of people are fascinated by it. And one of the things that I do like about it is that it uses trees as a source of food. Of course, we're all used to trees providing fruit, and they're good supports for climbers, but also they're fabulous for nuts. We don't grow or eat enough nuts in this country. And I love growing hazels. Here in the Jewel Garden, we have the purple hazel, which is Corylus maxima purpurea. And you can see that this has got a great beard sprouting from the sheath. And if I pick this off, the nuts on this are really good. So you can see that as well as being a fabulously decorative small tree or large shrub, it also produces delicious nuts and is worth growing for that alone. This is one of my favourite plants. It's Thalictrum delavei, and all of them have been grown from seed. And you can see, even when it's very small, it has these lovely, trembling little lavender mauve-coloured flowers. Now, I say little. In fact, it will grow to about 6 foot tall. I'm going to plant them here right the way down these borders. And if I space them out towards the back of the border, so they will rise up, you'll get this theme effect of these delicate leaves that look as though they're suspended, floating in air, and then these fragile flowers rising above them. But in fact, they're quite tough plants. When we first made these borders about 4 years ago, I thought that they would be particularly damp, and so I thought through the planting in terms of things that would relish damper than normal conditions. And what I've discovered is that although the soil does retain moisture very well, these apple trees suck it up like a sponge. So I've had to change the planting. Now that seems to me not a problem, but a creative opportunity. You have to deal with what is happening on the ground. And Adam has been to visit a garden called Dyffryn Fynant in Pembrokeshire, where they met conditions that at first seemed positively hostile. But that's when creativity kicked in, and the result is something very special indeed.
I think gardens are about 4 things. They're about people, plants, space, and the final one being place. That said, if you live in a town or a city, you've got a lot more to play with. Different materials, architecture. But I think when you're in the countryside, the best gardens feel like they belong. And just a few paces into this garden, it's clear this one really does belong. Almost 6 acres blends smoothly into this Pembrokeshire Valley. But it was a very different story 23 years ago when Christina Shand and her sons arrived. So, Christina, what was the garden like when you moved in?
Well, there wasn't a garden. Right. There was no garden at all. It had been a holiday cottage for 17 years, and before that a small farm. And there was nothing but concrete, bare stone, crumbling buildings, no garden whatsoever.
Wow, and you've been on a journey ever since?
Yes, I have. I loved it.
Now, it's an exquisite series of interlinking areas, including this central garden peppered with exotics. A wide herbaceous orchard. The topiary area, which is the most formal this garden gets. And the front garden, built on a base of solid rock. But once Christina had created it, she was hooked. How did you start to derive the rest of the garden?
This is the place. Yeah. This is the place that actually I've worked with it, gone with the areas that are there, let it teach me what plants will grow in which conditions. Loads of failures, very good things, failures, and you learn so much from them.
She worked within existing buildings and the old rubble walls, guided by a sense of place.
It was very much to do with the openness of the garden to the sky and the surrounding landscape and not wanting to enclose it or restrict it.
Working with the land like this has awakened Christina's creativity.
I had tried to paint, I tried to draw, I tried to write, I tried to sing. Disaster all round, you know. So I had this need to do something creative, and I found it in gardening.
That's
I found
incredible.
it in being able to play with plants.
But starting with a derelict farmhouse came at a high price. All the good land had been sold off long before she arrived.
What I was left with was the runt of the land of a very nice farm. So I got bog and I got rock. And one of my great beliefs is that every problem comes with a gift in its hands, and it's my responsibility to find the gift.
Some gifts were more unexpected than others. You are really dealing with some extreme conditions here, aren't you?
Yes, and this is a prime example, actually, because you're onto rock here, no topsoil at all, and there was old concrete, and I wanted to plant a wisteria here when I first came, you know. I thought, oh, yeah, lovely, all along the wall. So I broke out the concrete, started digging, water kept coming up.
Wow.
And I got really upset. Almost. And then a friend dowsed for it and said, you've got a surface well here. So I changed my mind completely and decided to make it into a boggy bed. And now we've got things that like it really wet, like the colocaceas.
And along the barn, the Banksian rose works really well instead. Christina lets nothing go to waste, so she creates this great eclectic mix. The water feature in front of me, she got that from an old farm sale. It's a still that you used to make liquor in. And she was telling me when she first got it, the kids used it as a boat down on the pond. And when they grew up and couldn't use it anymore, she created this water feature. I think it works really well. Look at that. It really is a fernery. It would have been so obvious here to put the compost bins or, you know, store some tools or some old barrows. It's the back of a building, another building. No, Christina creates this wonderful little space and it carries real atmosphere. You just want to sort of sit down and look around and enjoy the ferns, and that's what I love about ferns, looking at them close up. And she's planted my favourite fern, which is oak fern, Gymnocarpium. Beautiful sort of delicate plant. This really is a fascinating garden. It's like a great movie that you can watch several times and still see something different. I could lose days here. It's lovely talking to Christina and learning how she's created this space. And for me, she really understands this site and its conditions. But then she's given it a sense of place by the selection of materials and the plants, and just let it be. And it's ended up being a beautiful garden.
Whilst it's always just lovely to look at a beautiful garden, the really important lesson that I get from that is that by overcoming what can seem to be quite severe limitations and problems, actually you unlock the door to creativity that might have remained hidden. Every garden has limitations, every garden has problems. But if you can work around them and use them to your advantage, then it gets creative and interesting. Now, creative or not, here are some jobs that you can do this weekend. For shrub roses that are finished flowering, now is the time to prune them. And the best and easiest way to do this is with a pair of shears. Simply clip them over, removing about 1/3 of each bush to a neat dome. And if need be, you can address any individual pruning requirements next March. The best and simplest way to improve your lawn for next year is to aerate it. You can hire a machine that will do this for large areas, but for a smaller space, simply use a fork. It's important to work the tines in well and wriggle them around to really break up any compaction. And then if you follow that with a good scratch with a wire rake to remove any moss or thatch, it will go through the winter ready for next year. Now is a good time to plant up biennials such as wallflowers, sweet williams, forget-me-nots, or as I am, foxgloves. Plant them where you want them to flower. The roots will get nice and established so that next spring they are ready to grow fast and flower gloriously. And don't forget to water them in well. I do think the light on these September evenings is as good as any that you get throughout the year. The trouble is, there's less and less of it. The days are definitely drawing in, so we need to make the most of them. But that is it for today. There is just time to mention the fact that it's Nellie's birthday on Sunday, so raise a glass to her. And Nellie and myself and Nigel will be back at the same time next Friday. So until then, bye-bye.